Though the Donner Party had made many questionable judgment calls since leaving Independence back in May, none of those mistakes were anything compared to the huge blunder they were about to undertake. After leaving Fort Bridger, they deviated from the established California Trail route, preferring to take an untested, supposed shortcut that was being heavily promoted by Lansford Hastings as a time-saving alternative. James Reed was particularly gung-ho about taking the shortcut, and despite the fact that he wasn't the official leader of the wagon train, and apparently wasn't even that well liked, for whatever reason, the others followed his lead. But not everyone was enthusiastic about taking the Hastings Cutoff. George Donner's wife Tamsin, in particular, was said to have been pretty gloomy about it. But women didn't have much say in the matter back then, so they all left Fort Bridger and pressed on southwest towards what is now Utah. At first, the going was pretty easy. They were able to follow the tracks of Hastings himself, who was leading that wagon train that had left Fort Bridger just a few days before they got there. But then they reached the Wasatch Mountains. When they got here to the Weber River at the mouth of Echo Canyon, they found a handwritten note left by Hastings warning them that the route up Echo Canyon was impassable and that they should send someone ahead for instructions instead. So James Reed and a couple other men rode ahead to catch up with Hastings and saw for themselves how rough this canyon was to be dragging wagons up. When they caught up with the other wagon train, Hastings led them up to the top of a mountain and pointed out an alternate route they should take. I mean, he literally just pointed at another canyon and said, "Take that." So they did. So James Reed and the others rode back to the Donner camp as fast as they could, and the very next day, they set out on the new route, which ended up being just as bad, if not worse, than Echo Canyon. The canyon they took is now called Emigration Canyon, and it was gnarly, full of trees that had to be cut down and boulders that had to be moved. It was really slow going. They were only able to go a couple of miles a day. In fact, hacking their way through the Wasatch Mountains was so rough, it took 16 days to go 36 miles. They used to go more than that in 2 days when they were crossing the plains. And now, one last family joined the party. Some real laggers on the trail who caught up with the Donner Party just as they were beginning to hack their way through this canyon. Now, there was no one else behind them. They were the last group of pioneers trying to make it to California that year. This marker shows the place where the Donners finally emerged from the Wasatch Mountains. According to the plaque, by the time they got here to the mouth of the canyon, they were so tired of hacking down trees and moving boulders, they chose to lug their wagons up this hill instead. They had to use every single ox in their entire party to lug each wagon individually up and over this hill. Can you imagine those poor oxen? But they couldn't afford to let them rest because it was already late August, so they only had one more month of summer left to go another 600 miles. I'll bet at least a few members of the party were already regretting their decision to take this shortcut. But by now, it was kind of too late to turn back. Anyway, even after coming out of the mountains, their bad luck continued. One of James Reed's wagons broke an axle. Remember, he was still lugging around that double-decker Pioneer Palace. Well, they had to hike 15 miles back to find timber big enough to repair it. And then, on August 25th, the second member of the Donner Party died. A single guy who was traveling with the Donner family named Luke Halloran. Just like Sarah Keyes back at Alcove Spring, he had tuberculosis, and in fact, he was hoping that the climate in California would cure it. But he ended up being buried here at the edge of the Great Salt Desert. Once they finally got to the edge of the desert, they found another note from Hastings warning them that once they left this river, the Jordan River, they were facing 2 full days of travel with 0 water whatsoever. Usually, even out here in the arid West, they'd been able to find some kind of water source to camp by each evening. But this desert they were about to cross was unlike anything they had ever experienced. This is the actual campsite where the Donner Party stayed before setting off to cross that desert. Thanks to Hastings' note, at least they knew to spend a day here collecting extra grass and water to tide over their animals on the crossing. Speaking of these notes Hastings left, it's so frustrating to think that they were only a few days behind the rest of the wagon train that ended up making it over the Sierra in time. If they'd just pushed ahead or hauled ass or jettisoned some of the crap they were dragging with them, they might have been able to catch up. Shoulda, coulda, woulda. Anyway, at least Hastings left them those warnings. Okay, it's day 6 of my Donner Party journey. I only covered about 150 miles yesterday, but the terrain I covered took the Donner Party over a month because it was so rough. I'm camped out pretty far south of where the Donner Party stayed, but it was the only free camping I could find that wasn't in a truck stop parking lot. I wanted some peace and quiet and nature for a change. Unfortunately, that was not to be the case. Anyway, I'm heading off to reconnect with the Donner Trail now at the edge of the vast Salt Lake Desert. The Donner Party started the intense desert crossing on August 31st, the absolute peak of intense summer heat. According to Hastings' note and to what they'd heard back at Fort Bridger, they were facing a 40-mile journey to the next water source at the base of Pilot Peak, which they could see in the distance. Since the terrain was flat, they assumed they could cover about 20 miles a day, so they expected to only spend 1 night in the desert. So they only carried enough water to last them for 2 days. Remember, the oxen were exhausted from crossing the Wasatch, especially that last hill they made them lug the wagons up. So they didn't want to load them down with more heavy water barrels than was necessary, in addition to all the other heavy crap they were already pulling. What they didn't realize is this desert isn't really that hard packed. It's really more of a marshy, boggy muck with a dry crust on top that makes it look solid. But the mules, oxen, wagon wheels, and feet of the party members broke through that crust, and they ended up wading through muck. The mud clogged the wagon wheels and covered everyone's feet, and the animals sunk in it up to their knees at some points. Talk about slow going. Crossing this desert made crossing the Wasatch Mountains look like cake. Add to that the fact that this was August in the desert, and the days were scorching, blisteringly hot. But they had to be stingy with water, since they weren't carrying very much. And to make matters worse, it gets really cold up here at night. So if they weren't broiling, they were freezing. To get across as quickly as possible, they didn't even stop to rest much. They just marched on, day and night, just trying to get it over with. But after 2 full days with hardly any water or rest, the poor animals started to give out. The oxen and mules just couldn't pull all that weight through that muck any farther. So the teamsters ended up unhitching them and driving them ahead towards the spring at Pilot Peak, which still didn't look much closer after 2 days of travel. The plan was to let the animals drink and rest up and then bring them back to retrieve the wagons. By now, the wagon train had spread out quite a bit. Each family was going as fast as it could. some lagging behind more than others. And the Reed family, with that heavy friggin' Pioneer Palace, was at the very back of the line. The Reeds sat in the shade of their wagons all day waiting for their teamsters to return with their oxen so they could leave, but they never showed up. And by nightfall, they were getting dangerously low on water, so they decided to abandon their wagons and head for the spring on foot. So James Reed, his sickly wife, their 4 children, and 5 lapdogs all headed off across the desert in the freezing cold night. After straggling through the desert all night, in the morning they finally caught up with Jacob Donner's wagons, which were stuck in the desert just a ways ahead of them, and they found out why their teamsters hadn't come back. Apparently, when their poor oxen smelled the water at Pilot Peak, they went nuts and ran off. That's like losing your car engine. They were totally stranded now. So James Reed left his wife and children with Jacob Donner's family and rode ahead here to the spring at the base of Pilot Peak, where the rest of the wagon train was already waiting. After resting up, he went back that evening with Jacob Donner and hauled everyone else the rest of the way to the spring. Sorry guys, I'm almost done. These cows aren't happy that I'm here, so I better make this video quick. It took 5.5 days to cross that 40-mile desert, which I think is actually more like 65 miles. And it cost them even more time because they had to spend a week resting here at the springs, trying to round up all the missing animals and drag James Reed's wagons out of the desert. Now people were starting to get kind of grouchy. I mean, they were exhausted, sun-baked, dehydrated, and they were probably starting to get kind of nervous about the time. It was already well into September, and they still had to cross the Sierra before it started snowing. You know how it is when people start getting tired and scared, they start blaming each other. Maybe rightfully so, many families in the wagon train blamed the Reeds for the delay. Most of the missing animals they were trying to round up belonged to them, and they even made that expedition back out onto the desert to try and drag out their wagons. It was useless, though. All the Reeds had left was 1 cow and 1 ox, hardly enough to pull all 3 of their wagons. So they ended up burying all their stuff out there in the desert, I guess intending to come back someday and retrieve it. All they were able to take with them, of course, was that giant friggin' Pioneer Palace. They stuffed what they could inside and then had to borrow oxen from other families just to pull that. A couple of the other families had to abandon wagons as well, but the Reeds suffered the most by far. They went from being the richest family in the wagon train to the brokest. Anyway, when the Donner Party finally rolled out of here on September 10th, they were in pretty rough shape, especially the animals. And they still had almost 600 more miles to go.